Rangatirama, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Nau mai, haere mai ko tēnei hui ki te hāpai te kaupapa o te rānei. He karakia tīmatanga. Whakatakata hau ki te uru, whakatakata hau ki te tonga, ki āma kinakina ki uta, ki āma taratara ki tai. E hi aki ana te tākura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, tihei mauriora. Kia ora koutou, i ngā manuhiri, e rau rangatirama. Tēnei te mihi nui ki a koutou katoa, nau mai, haere mai, ki tēnei webinar, ki te kaupapa, ki te hāpai te kaupapa o te ahi nei, mō te ETS. Kia ora koutou everybody, and welcome to this webinar, the second public webinar as part of the consultation with regards to proposed changes and for the ETS. Thank you very much for registering and for coming along this afternoon. Many of you will know that this is the second of three public consultation webinars that we are holding with regards to this kaupapa. Just by way of introduction and what we'll be doing this afternoon, ko ai au, ko moana Eruwera Takuingoa. I'm the Implementation Manager for the Planning and Advisory Service, Turu Rākau New Zealand Forestry Service, and I'll be facilitating today's hui. Shortly, we will hear or watch a video which was recorded from last week's webinar where the Minister Nash, the Minister for Forestry, outlines his vision around proposed changes to the ETS. And then following that, Hemi Smiler, who is the Director of Climate Mitigation for the Ministry for the Environment, will also give a short introduction. We'll then be followed, or that will be followed by a number of presentations from officials, at which time we'll take a break to be able to answer any questions that you might have for us. So again, nau mai, haere mai, kia ora, a very warm welcome to you all, and thank you for taking the time this afternoon to join us. Sam, if I can ask for the Minister's introduction. Thank you.
Moana, ka nui te mihi kia koutou. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Look, I'd like to thank everyone who's here for the first consultation on a discussion document we put out recently. We need to get this right because unlike other sectors of the economy, decisions that we make today can't be undone easily at all. And so I'm here to respectfully listen. I know this hui is down for 2 hours. I do apologise. I will have to leave at 11 o'clock. But I'm very keen to hear the feedback and the views and the opinions of those on the hui. However, what I will do is I'm just going to give you a little bit of my background and then make a couple of points and then throw it back to Moana to facilitate this. First and foremost, for those who I haven't met, I have a master's degree in forestry science. I worked for Carthold Harvey, I worked for Fletcher Challenge in forestry, and I also worked in Japan in forestry. In Japan, when I was there, we were cutting down, trees that were 200, 300, 400 years old. It was very much an intergenerational forest. The one I was working in, it was a mountain village, about 250 kilometres south of Tokyo, and their view was not too dissimilar to the Māori world view around kaitiakitanga. They were there to ensure the sustainability and longevity of the forest, and they realised that what they were doing was very definitely intergenerational. In fact, the house I was living in was 350 years old. So a worldview. I also worked for someone called Dr. Jerry McSweeney for 8 months, and Jerry had been the head of Forest and Bird, and he bought a very rundown lodge on the west coast of the South Island and moved his family down there at a time when it was reasonably contentious. We just stopped the logging down there, but Jerry always believed that he could make more money out of ecotourism than he ever could out of harvesting native forests. And I think he's gone on to prove that that is the case. He still has his Lake Moeraki Wilderness Lodge, and he still has the Afforestation down there. But I've been reading, thinking, and writing a lot about this recently. And let me just outline some of those thoughts that I've had and the reasons why I'm keen on a particular direction. But as mentioned, no decision has been made, and hence the reason for the consultation, because there's no doubt there'll be things that we have missed that we will need to consider when working in partnership with the sector and all our key stakeholders, and certainly with iwi Māori when we make final decisions on this. I have been reasonably clear in the media, I think, over the last 2 or 3 months, that I have a preference that only native trees are part of the permanent forestry scheme that comes into place on the 1st of January next year. And there may be a couple of exceptions to that, small exceptions, but let me outline the reasons for my views. The first one is conservation and ecological reasons. And within that, there are subsets around biodiversity and forest health. Radiata pine has a biological lifespan of around about 100 years. If we include radiata in the permanent forest category, and if a couple of the reports that have been commissioned and written by the Forest Service are right, we could end up with hundreds of thousands of hectares planted in radiata in permanent forest. And, with someone from the east coast of the North Island, I cannot imagine the issues that we would end up with in 100 years when we have 100,000 hectares of radiata that is nearing the end of its biological life, and the conservation and ecological issues we have as we're removing a whole lot of these trees from our waterways, our lakes and our rivers and our beaches. When I hear people say radiata is a good nursery crop for natives coming through, I have no evidence to support that whatsoever. In fact, my wife and I walked the Queen Charlotte Sound Walk just recently, and Doc is in the process of poisoning a whole lot of old man radiata that are of the 100-year-old age, and just there is a massive problem there. They are not good nursery crops. And when I hear people say, no, what we'll do is we'll plant these and we'll send people up to cut light wells in, well, from a health and safety perspective, which we're only getting, is only becoming a much higher degree of integrity. Getting a man or a woman up on grade 7 and 8 land to cut light wells in mature forests, I just don't think will be able to be done, let alone predator fencing forests on class 7 or 8 land, just prohibitively expensive. But from a conservation and ecological reason, there is no evidence to suggest to me that radiata is a good nursery crop for native species coming through. The second thing that I would like to say is that I do agree that we need to get the financial incentives right if it is only about natives in the permanent forest category. And there is a lot of work going on at the moment in the Forest Service, but also in the private sector, led by, for example, Pure Advantage, where they have taken certain native species, and mainly at this stage, Kānuka and Mānuka, but not exclusively, and saying, okay, we need to better understand the carbon sequestration of certain native species so we can go out to the market with a viable financial proposition for planting of these species for natives over and above radiata. And I do think we will get there to the point where, talking to the Pure Advantage guys, we're not too far away from a value proposition which is reasonably close to radiata, but that will come in time. But I do acknowledge the work does need to be done, because as we all know, at this point in time, you get the same level of sequestration through the lookup tables if you're planting Kānuka on the east coast as you do if you're planting Kākatea on the west coast of the South Island. So I do get that proposition. The other thing that we need to look at is actually income from native trees. I have 3 modern books in my office that talk about the non-wood value from Indigenous forestry. And we put a little bit of money into from the PGF into this up north with Ngāti Hine to look at the farmer and perhaps the, or certainly the nutria, but certainly the farmer benefits that will come from native forests. And if we look around the world, the products we have got from forests, no matter where they are around the world, that have advanced medicine have been huge. And if we believe that Maori have been using native trees for 1,000 years for medicine, I do believe that there is huge potential in our native forests to come up with income streams that are outside of pure carbon and pure wood property. The other thing I would say is I know there is an issue or a belief that if we plant native trees and only native trees in the permanent forest category, then we run the risk of not meeting our climate change targets. And there are two things I would say to that. First and foremost, the government is doing a lot of work around how we reduce or the settings we have to have in place to reduce gross emittings from high emitting industries. So, planting of trees and sequestering carbon through our forests is not the only game in town by any stretch of the imagination. The other thing I would say is if we do buy into the argument, which I hope we don't, but if we do buy into the argument that planting a whole lot of exotic forests is the only way we are going to sequester carbon and meet our climate change targets, then I believe all we are doing is transferring our one problem from this generation to generations in the future as we seek to mop up carbon through the planting of radiata with this generation to the ecological and conservation issues that we will end up with that future generations will have to cope with, as I mentioned before. So for me, there are a number of reasons. So also for me, when we're talking about planting, it is managing for 500 years, not for 50 years. The other thing that I am well aware is the government cannot solve this on its own, but nor can the private sector solve it on its own either. So I am very keen to understand how we better work in true partnership. And this is something that I have talked about in numerous forums with the private sector and certainly with Maori iwi to get to a point where we are on the same page in terms of A, sequestering carbon, B, ensuring that we end up with the sort of biodiversity and forest health that we require, and C, end up with intergenerational management of our forests in a way that not only creates economic value, but also creates societal value as well. The last thing that I will say is that I am here to genuinely listen to the concerns, to the ideas, to the opportunities, to the issues that people do have around the direction that I have articulated, and certainly the direction that a number of my ministerial colleagues have articulated. There is other work going on, and David Parker and Damien O'Connor released a discussion document around changing the Overseas Investment Act. So if overseas investors want to buy a farm and convert that into forestry, they have to go through a full OAO process as opposed to the special forest test. That is still out for consultation. But the last thing I'll say before I wind up is please do not think that I'm anti-radiata in any way, shape or form. What I am for is a forest industry that is about the right tree in the right place. I would love to see significant investment in downstream processing in our industry, and that will require a significant amount of exotics, predominantly radiata, to be planted in plantation forestry that can then be harvested and manufactured in any number of products. And we have an industry transformation plan in forestry and wood processing underway at this point in time that is seeking to better understand what we need to do as a government to better incentivize plantation forestry for the manufacturing sector. So having said that, there are some really innovative ways we can look to work together in this space. But as mentioned, I will now turn off. If I do click out at 11 a.m., I was going to say 11 p.m., because we could talk about this for 24 hours, I know that. But if I do switch off, please just understand I've got to go to another meeting. It's not for any other reason. But in the meantime, once again, thank you very much for engaging. This is, I believe, a really important part of work that we need to get right. So kia ora. And kia
ora koutou. So if I can invite Hemi Smiler, Director for Climate Mitigation Ministry for the Environment, to address you. Kia ora, Hemi.
Kia ora moa and kia ora koutou. Can we start the slide deck, please? Okay, yeah, so the Minister's done a good job of scene setting for this webinar. I'll continue to do a little bit of that and go into a little bit more detail. So climate change remains a challenge that we cannot postpone. Currently the government is leading the design and delivery of New Zealand's first emissions reduction plan and the first national adaptation plan for release this year. These plans will help New Zealand transition to a climate resilient, low emission circular economy. A key part of our climate strategy and direction setting are our international and domestic targets. Next slide, please. Our targets, next slide. Our targets have been set up to help limit warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. These targets are represented by an international target, which is our nationally determined contribution, and is a net emissions target to reduce by 50% below gross 2000 levels in 2030, including having at least a 10% reduction in biogenic methane. We then have longer term goals out to 2050. We're also developing domestic emissions budgets, which will help us reach our targets, being our international ones, which can be met by reducing emissions and through sequestration from forests, which will be outlined when the emissions reduction plan is released in May. Next slide, please. Afforestation is an important part of meeting both climate change targets. However, it is also something that we can use to provide New Zealand with an opportunity to support the development of biofuels, promote a more circular economy, design biodiversity co-benefits, and to play a key role in how iwi Māori, farmers, landowners and investors can diversify their income streams. It is important that we get afforestation right. From 2023, under the current rules, a new permanent forestry category of the ETS would allow both exotic and indigenous forests to be registered in the ETS and to earn New Zealand units. We want to balance the risks created by new permanent exotic forests, which are not intended for harvest, and we have a window to build safeguards into the system prior to a new ETS framework coming into force on the 1st of January 2023. We want to encourage the right tree in the right place for the right reason. The aim of this consultation is to get feedback on how we might balance the need for afforestation with wider needs of local communities, regional economies, rights and interests of iwi and Māori and the environment. Now, this work was initiated because increasing NZU prices had been driving higher rates of afforestation, particularly fast-growing permanent exotic forests. High rates of permanent exotic afforestation has been raising three key concerns. Firstly, we are seeing impacts on rural communities, economies and productive land from changes in land use. Secondly, we've been seeing large areas of exotic forests without ongoing management posing long-term environmental risks. And finally, there is a risk of oversupply of NZUs into the NZETS that could dampen medium-term carbon prices and curtail the uptake of low-carbon technologies to reduce emissions. As a result of this consultation, we are interested in identifying if you agree with our description of the problem, and if you have evidence that you can share that supports or contradicts this problem definition, or that demonstrates other problems within this particular problem set. Slide, please. Through this consultation, we want to ensure that we get the answers from New Zealand and from stakeholders that are affected about how we might incentivise the right type of afforestation that delivers on multiple objectives and manages the risks I just highlighted. Our broader objectives for forestry include sequestration so that we can meet our climate change targets, substitution so that forestry and wood processing can support the transition to a low carbon bioeconomy, that forestry and wood sectors contribute to regional and economic development and support the well-being of rural communities, that new and existing forests provide and support native biodiversity, that our forests support freshwater quality, soil conservation and resilience to climate change, and that forests and forest products support the cultural, social, environmental and economic aspirations of Māori, whānau, hapu and iwi. To do this, the government is seeking feedback on a proposal to prevent exotic forests from registering in the permanent post-1989 category in the New Zealand ETS, whether we should adjust how carbon accounting applies to production forests on remote and marginal land to harvest land, and opportunities for improving incentives for Indigenous afforestation. I will now hand over to my colleague Nigel, who will lead the next part of the discussion.
Thank you, Hemi. That was a great introduction. Thank you. I see we've got some questions already, and we'll be seeking to answer those questions after this session. So my name's Nigel Searles, and I'm an analyst at MPI, and I'm just going to take you through the government's proposals to prevent exotic forests from registering in the permanent post-89 category within the ETS. So next slide, please, Hemi. So the 2020 ETS reforms introduced a permanent post-89 forest category to replace the permanent forest sink initiative that was outside the emissions trading scheme. This category will provide landowners with New Zealand units for exotic or Indigenous forests, and the scheme that will not be clear-felled for at least 50 years. The new permanent forest category becomes available from the 1st of January next year. And so this provides us with a small window of opportunity to consider the types of permanent forests that should be allowed in this category prior to it becoming available. Next slide, please. So shown are our options, or the government's options to manage permanent exotic forestry within the emissions trading scheme. So our option one, clearly that's no change, that's the status quo. So allowing unlimited exotic and or Indigenous forest registration in the category. Our option two prevents exotic forestry from registering in the category. Option three is essentially the same as option two, but it provides exceptions for exotic species under certain conditions or criteria, and that might include providing wider benefits like erosion control, and I'll discuss those later in the presentation. Option three has some sub-options relating to implementation, and this is either using a moratorium or a ban. For example, a temporary time-limited moratorium could be introduced while we develop the exceptions for exotic forests. Alternatively, a ban could be used with exceptions introduced over time. In practice, these sub-options will be very similar, with the moratorium providing more certainty of when the category is like to reopen to exceptions for exotic forests. So what we would like to know of these options, what is your preferred approach? And are there any options that we haven't considered? Next slide, please. So options 2 and 3 are our preferred options. And that is because they help us manage the risk of large-scale conversions of productive land into permanent exotic forests. They help meet our climate change targets by offsetting emissions reductions while gross emissions are actively reduced. And they also help address environmental risks, and they could help improve the relative incentive for Indigenous forests on less productive land. However, we are aware that this alone, more measures are required to really make a move on Indigenous afforestation. If we choose either of these preferred options, we want to introduce these from the 1st of January next year when the category comes available. So we would like to know, do you agree with our preferred approach of acting before the 1st of January next year? And if not, what is your preference? Next slide, please. If we choose to exclude exotic forests from the NZETS permanent category, there will need to be some detailed rules around how forests enter the category and how to manage the changes in forests over time. We'll need to ensure that the restrictions for exotic forests are enforceable and able to be enforced. So therefore, we'd like feedback on how should we define an Indigenous forest, what threshold is acceptable. We're aware that particularly in the case of afforestation, very few forests will be 100% exotic or Indigenous. So there's likely to be some threshold around that's a happy medium. We'd like to know what should happen if Indigenous forests register in the permanent category, change and become exotic forests over time. So how should they be treated? Should we remove the land from the ECS immediately? Should we allow the land to remain in the ECS but transition to, for example, averaging accounting? Or should we provide a time period for the participant to become compliant again? Next slide, please. Option 3 provides options for exceptions, as I briefly discussed before, and for exotic species in certain circumstances. So we'd like your feedback on whether we should consider exemptions for exotic forests in the category, and if so, under what circumstances. Examples of these exceptions could include small parcels of erosion-prone land, certain long-lived exotic species like redwoods, for example, for amenity or sustainable harvest of high-value timbers, or exotic forests under active management to transition to indigenous forests over time. However, we'd need to work through the risks before exemptions are created. For example, exceptions for long-lived exotic species could create loopholes, meaning the policy may have little impact. In the transitioning of forests from exotic to indigenous species, we'd need to ensure that these forests are managed to this intent, and we'd need to understand and mitigate for any liability that could occur from a drop in carbon stock as these forests transition to an indigenous species. There may also have to be conditions and criteria to make sure these plantings are at a scale that can be managed and that it occurs in suitable environments. So I think we're opening for questions now, and we've already got a few questions online there. I've got a question here around from Blair. So thank you for your question. Stating that whilst radiata is not a good nursery crop, many exotics exist that that could be. The issue seems to be largely pine. So why isn't pine excluded? Just to clarify that, like there's been a body of research, particularly by Adam Fords, over the last 5 or 6 years, and previously back to 2001 from Landcare, and the research has found that pine can be a nursery species, but it has to be managed to that extent. It has to be in a favourable environment, close to a seed source, under favourable conditions. So, but if you've got any evidence of other species that would be more lend themselves better to a nursery crop, then we'd certainly like to hear about them. And Blair goes on to say, the Climate Change Commission note in its paper that's basically a done deal to exclude exotics. I think from memory, their finding was for the government to create a position on, it wasn't as definitive as being a done deal. It was creating a position on for the government to create a position on the role of permanent exotic forests within its climate change response. Yeah, and there's another question here from Blair around the time it takes to process ETS registrations. And we certainly within the discussion document itself, we've pointed out that we certainly want to hear where commitments and investments have been made towards planting permanent forests, and whether we have that timing right. So we certainly welcome that within your submission. I think, Robin Webster, if I understand that the averaging category is perhaps more suited to harvesting forests, arguably. Some of us may differ in that, and that category is certainly not going away for forests that are intended to harvest. There's also, Simon, my colleague from Turiraka, will correct me if I'm wrong, but there's also various different species within that averaging regime. For example, I think exotic softwoods is one for longer rotations. And just to clarify, where the averaging, we're not proposing to exclude exotic forests from the averaging category. That category remains for exotic forests, just the permanent category there.
Great, thanks, Nigel. So, just for those on line, so please pose your questions in the Q&A chat down the bottom, and we will endeavour where we can to answer those live, or to supply a written answer to you as well.
There's a question here from Janice that I'll answer. Defining, I think for the purpose of this consultation, a permanent forest or the permanent, as defined within the permanent category that comes into force next year, they are forests planted with no intention to harvest for at least 50 years. And I think, so that possibly answers your question, although in reality, just with the liabilities at harvest, it may, someone may be better to talk to this than me, but there's obviously an option to roll that 50 year time over. So harvesting might be unlikely within that category, but you've outlined a selective harvest, and that is still available, obviously.
Cool. Oh, Nigel, do you want to mute? Yeah. So, yeah, just to jump in on that one. Thanks, Nigel. Yeah. So the canopy cover that will need to be maintained in the permanent category is 30%. So you can do some limited selective harvest. The rules are against clear fell harvesting in the permanent category, and the rules that Nigel was talking about in terms of the time length of the permanent category. The current rules are that when you register or elect to join the permanent category in the ETS, you will be in there for 50 years. At the end of that 50-year period, there are options. So you can either surrender units back down to the average age of the forest, then you become an averaging forest and the forest can be clear fell harvested. That surrender liability is likely to be very significant for most forests. The other option is you renew your permanent period for another 25 years and can continue to earn units on the stock change approach. If the tables go out that far, I assume in 50 years' time they will be extended to do so if the forest is still growing. The third option is that you can surrender all the units that forest has earned and leave the ETS. And that means you can deforest that land, convert it out of forestry into another use, or you could keep it in forestry but just not participate in the ETS and earn units. I think that also lines up with someone else's question around the selective harvest. So it is 30% canopy cover in each hectare. So it's really, you won't be able to do any clear fell harvesting, but some selective taking of trees would be allowed under the permanent category.
Great, thanks, Simon. I wonder if we'll keep moving on with the presentation from Simon and Steve, and then we'll return to answering your questions as well.
Sure thing. Thanks, Moana. So today I'm going to be quickly presenting on the option in the discussion document around a proposal to change how radiata is accounted for in the ETS under averaging when that radiata is planted on hard to harvest or remote land. So if we go to the next slide, please. These first two slides are just a quick overview of how averaging works to provide some context for this option. Averaging applies for all newly registered forests in the ETS from 2023, unless those forests sign up to the permanent activity. Under averaging, a forest will earn units based on the long-term amount of carbon that kind of forest is likely to store. That's the average amount of carbon stored over many planting and harvesting cycles, and it assumes that the typical harvest age of the forest, the harvest age of the forest to calculate the long-term average carbon is the typical harvest age of the forest we see in the estate. Averaging offers really large benefits for production forests compared to the older stock change approach. A lot of units are earned and then held after harvest, and it also provides a lot of flexibility to manage the forest as you wish after the average carbon stock's been reached, with no surrender liabilities from the ETS. It also closely aligns with how our target accounting works. So forests planted and credited under averaging will be lining up with the amount of carbon they store towards our international goals as well. The age that the forest reaches its average carbon stock is called the average age. So just for the rest of this presentation, if I talk about average age, that means the age that the forest reaches its long-term average carbon stock. Next slide, please. So to bring this all together, here's a diagram. It uses radiata because radiata is by far the most common production forest in our estate, and it's also the kind of forest we'll be talking about today. So as an example, a first rotation forest registered under averaging will earn units on the green part of that line from when it is registered up until it reaches an age of 16. That is the average age of radiata in the ETS under averaging, and it's based on an assumed harvest age of 28. Once the forest reaches that age, it can be harvested whenever the owner wishes. The forest type can be changed, so you could harvest pine and replant hardwoods, or you could leave the forest and transition it to indigenous over time, with no requirement to surrender units under the ETS. The only thing to pay attention to after you've reached the average age is that if you do deforest, so if you convert that forest into a farm, for example, you'll still have to pay back all the credits that that forest has earned over its lifetime. And that will be based on what it earned when it was registered in the scheme on its first rotation, not necessarily what's there at the time you deforest. Next slide, please. So this slide talks about land which is in a position where harvesting radiata at age 28 is too expensive. And that means that typical production radiata may not be suitable for this land, as most radiata in the country is harvested at 28. And some of this land is great for growing high quality trees, but won't typically return profit at harvest if it's harvested at 28, because the land's either too far from the port or it has particularly high harvesting costs. There's a lack of infrastructure, the land's quite isolated or small blocks, etc. And in the averaging consultation, some submitters told us that harvest can become viable on this land as the trees get older and the timber quality improves. The trees also keep getting larger, so you get more volume for the same fixed costs from harvesting. We've heard anecdotally that mills will pay more for older radiata forests, logs, due to the improvement in wood quality that can happen over time. Some people have also proposed using the additional carbon income from the ETS to help offset some of the harvesting costs on this land, particularly on that first rotation where you need to establish harvesting infrastructure. Given all these factors, there were some submissions in the last averaging consultation that proposed that this remote land could become viable to harvest at age 40 if it's planted in radiata and become an ongoing longer rotation radiata crop. However, all the radiata forest grown on this land is likely to be a lot older than age 28 when it's harvested. So the typical harvest age we've used to calculate what radiata earns credits to in the ETS will be too low, and the forest would actually store more carbon than it will be receiving credits for over the long term. Some stakeholders were quite concerned that the opportunity for production forestry on this more remote land would be constrained without participants being able to earn that additional carbon. Next slide, please. So we've got an opportunity to consider changes to the average age for radiata on this more remote and marginal to harvest land, recognizing that extra carbon stored in the forest. The option we are consulting on and want your feedback on is, if radiata is planted where it currently isn't profitable to harvest at age 28, on its first rotation, it could earn units up to the average age of 21. That would be an additional 5 years longer than it would under the current settings. This is based on an assumed harvest age of 40, which is based on the feedback that we had in the last consultation on averaging. This increase would give participants around 150 to 200 units per hectare, depending on exactly where the forest is in the country. But for example, in the Bay of Plenty, a radiata forest will earn 330 carbon credits per hectare under the current averaging settings. If it were in this remote land category, it would earn up to around 500 units per hectare. Next slide, please. So what we're interested in hearing from everyone during this consultation is basically your feedback on this long rotation category. We're keen to hear whether you think it's a good idea, whether it should be introduced. Some of the key things are, is this longer rotation radiata model really viable? Given that the carbon price has increased quite a lot since the last consultation, is the current approach under averaging still a barrier to unlocking production forestry on this land? We also want feedback on what some of the impacts might be from introducing the category. For example, do you see a risk that radiata ends up being planted on this more remote land that otherwise would have maybe been planted in other species that are already kind of longer lived on average and are recognised as such in the ETS? And if it is planted on that land, is it a problem? We also know that Māori land is disproportionately likely to be far from port or have other attributes that make harvest more expensive. So we're really interested in whether there are particular impacts for Māori from introducing this category or not. We also want some feedback on the key design questions of this category. So what criteria should we be considering when determining whether a plot of land would be in this longer rotation category? Is age 40 an appropriate age? That was what was suggested to us at the last consultation, but how would you like us to calculate it? Because there isn't actually an existing forest estate in this position that we can go and get data from. There's also no guarantee that these forests will be harvested. So we're interested in whether you think any measures are needed to mitigate risks around the forests being left permanently. Finally, we're interested in whether there are any options outside the ETS that could encourage this kind of forestry on this land and unlock the potential of this land that's further away from port. These could be additional to the existing averaging rules, for example. Yeah, thanks very much for listening. I will be hanging around after Steve's presentation to take questions and discuss this with you. But I'll now hand over to Steve Mason, who's going to present on Indigenous afforestation incentives. Thanks.
Kia ora. My name is Steve Mason. Hopefully you can hear me okay. I don't think my camera's working. Great. So my name is Steve Mason. I'm an analyst in the Ministry for Primary Industries. I want to give you today a brief update on our work for opportunities for improving incentives for native afforestation. So we're still at the early stages of the POSI development here. But we wanted to use today the opportunity to give you a quick update and also to hear more about your views too. Thank you. Next slide. Yep. So the Climate Change Commission recommended the establishment of new permanent Indigenous forests. This is to help offset residual emissions from hard to abate sectors and also maintain net zero greenhouse gas emissions from beyond 2050. In the right place, new native forests can provide much wider benefits beyond carbon capture, like erosion control, enhanced water quality, and as well as biodiversity outcomes. Whilst there is some existing government assistance, land retirement and native reforestation mainly rely on the efforts and funding of landowners, iwi, corporates, and community groups. Current and projected rates of Indigenous afforestation are much lower than those proposed and recommended by the Commission. There are many reasons behind this. They include the high costs of establishment, the availability of incentives, as well as the limited potential for returns to offset the costs. Consultation on the emissions reduction plan indicated widespread support for greater levels of Indigenous reforestation. A number of key themes emerged during that consultation, with submitters suggesting a range of potential solutions, including updating ETS lookup tables to ensure carbon capture is accurately accounted for, as well as suggestions for reducing barriers to registering a native forest in the ETS. There are also calls for greater support from government as well as incentives. This included also advice and knowledge sharing, as well as greater support for pest control. There were also calls for work to help reduce costs of establishments. Next slide, please. So, as I said at the start, we are still at the early stages of the policy development here for incentivising native afforestation, and really keen to understand more about your views and your priorities in this area. I would welcome your feedback today, building on what we've heard so far during the emissions reduction plan consultation and also previous engagement we've had too. You'll see on the slides here some topics where we welcome your feedback and your thoughts, but please do not feel that you have to limit yourselves to these topics either today or in your written response.
Kia ora koutou, ko James Coombs tōku ingoa. My name is James Coombs and I am the Kai Whaikahaere, the manager of the MFE Emissions Trading Scheme Policy Team, and I have the pleasure to cover off the next steps and closing points for today's webinar. Engagement and collaboration with our treaty partners, stakeholders and industry is a crucial part of developing enduring forestry and emissions trading scheme policies that balance outcomes for our environment, economy, land use and local communities. We really appreciate everyone making the time to attend and engage on these proposals today, as your feedback will support and inform further policy development. In addition to today's webinar, we would also like to invite you to submit your written submission on the consultation by 5 p.m. on Friday, the 22nd of April. You can submit through 3 avenues. The first is submitting an online submission form, which can be found on MPI's website hosting the consultation document. The web address for this is found on this slide. You can also send your submission to us via email by emailing this email address, mpi.forestry@mpi.govt.nz. Alternatively, you can send your submission to us via post to this address, Ministry for Primary Industries, PO Box 2526, Wellington 6140. Next slide, please. So that concludes today's webinar. On behalf of officials, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Thank you everyone for taking the time to attend today's webinar on managing exotic afforestation incentives. Before I pass over to Moana for our closing karakia, a quick reminder that the government is planning to consult on different resource management proposals for land use and forestry later this year. There will be other requests for stakeholder engagement as part of our wider forestry and emissions trading scheme work programme. So please keep an eye out for any announcements on the MPI and MFE websites and on our social media pages. If you would also like further information on current emissions trading scheme forestry settings or the emissions trading scheme as a whole, please visit our agency MPI and MFE websites for further guidance material. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Thank you for attending. Your input is important to developing enduring policy outcomes, so we appreciate your engagement in today's hui. I'll now pass back to Moana for the closing karakia.
Kia ora James, and kia ora koutou, kia ora mō koutou whakaro me o koutou kōrero. Thank you for your thoughts and for your discussions and for your questions today. This karakia to close our hui. Kua whakairea te tapu, kia wātea ai te ara, kia tūriki whakataka ai, kia tūriki whakataha ai, humie huie tāki. Kia ora koutou,